Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to episode 22 of It's Murder Up North. This is part 3 of the Donald Neilson episodes. If you haven't done so, please listen to episode 20 and 21 before starting this one. In today's show, I will be focusing on the police interviews, trial and the life of Donald Neilson, from which you can form your own thoughts of the man and his crimes. One thing that has become clear with this case is that as time has passed, the stories become distorted, exaggerated, and contrary information has arisen. Wherever possible, I have tried to use contemporary sources, such as newspaper articles from the time, with a particular mention to Pauline Hepburn, the crime reporter for the Birmingham Daily Post, who covered the case and whose articles have provided a wealth of information. Before I head to the episode, please check out my podcast of the week, Broken Utopia, hosted by Kira, who you may recognise from her podcast Murder and More. Over the last few months, I've had the privilege to get to know Kira. She is a wonderful person and I wish her every success with her podcast. Here is a sneak peek of Broken Utopia.
There are so many quotes about life. Aristotle once said that it is in our darkest moments that we must focus to see the light. Nelson Mandela is quoted as saying that the greatest glory in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. American lecturer Ralph Waldo Emerson said that life is a succession of lessons which must be lived to be understood. This is Broken Utopia, a podcast where I, your solo host Kira, turn my blog posts about life, loss, love and grief into a podcast. Join me every Friday beginning the 1st of May. Until then, follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Broken Utopia Pod.
Now, let's head to the episode. Following his arrest in Mansfield in December 1975, officers finally had the opportunity to be face to face with the man they had been hunting for 3 years. Donald Neilson was taken to the interview room, his face bloodied and bruised from the beating he had received from the members of the public who had come to help P.C. Mackenzie and P.C. White. Now he sat at the table opposite Commander John Morrison and Detective Chief Superintendent Harold Wright. What follows are excerpts from his initial interviews with the officers. Commander Morrison began questioning by stating, "We have reason to believe you can assist us with our inquiries with regards to the kidnap and murder of Leslie Whittle." It took 15 minutes for Neilson to respond. "No, sir, not me, sir. Not Leslie Whittle." Morrison then asked, "Do you feel quite fit? Or would you prefer some rest?" To which Neilson replied, "No, thank you, sir. I am wide awake, but you look a bit tired." Morrison, ignoring Neilson's remark, continued, "Have you ever been to Highley?" 10 minutes passed. Neilson looked quietly at the breeze-blocked walls, as though he was counting each brick. This was a pattern he would repeat throughout his interviews. He then responded calmly, "No, sir, not me, sir." Howard Wright asked, "Have you been to Bathpool Park, then?" After a further delay, the prisoner said, "I'm not sure about this." Howard Wright asked, "Do you want anything? Any more food or tea?" A cup of tea, please, sir. Throughout the interviews, Neilson presents himself as a well-mannered individual who has a great deal of respect for authority. His demeanour, however, changed when the officers began to question him about his family, in particular his daughter. With the mention of his child, he became greatly agitated. "She is about 16. What do you want to know about her for? What's that got to do with this?" The interview was concluded for the night and resumed at 5:20 the following morning. It was recorded that prior to the interview commencing, Neilson became extremely distressed and started to cry. He then sat silently for half an hour. Once Neilson had settled down, the officers began by asking him if he had been to Bathpool Park. Neilson retorted, quote, "I don't know, sir. I've been lots of places. I may have been these places. How can I remember?" He was then asked where he was on January the 14th, 1975. "I can't remember, sir. I go lots of places. I can't remember about January. Dates mean nothing to me." He was then asked if he had kidnapped and murdered Leslie Whittle. Neilson at this point became unsettled and started to cry. "No, sir, not me. Not murder the young girl." He paused and then continued. "I know you've got a job to do. I realise that, but it is just too distressing." At 6:38 a.m. the interview was terminated. When it resumed that afternoon, Neilson once again told the officers that he was very distressed by the situation. The question was again posed to him. Had he been to Highley Village? This time Neilson responded, "Once or twice, I think." Mr. Wright asked, "Have you ever been to Bathpool Park?" "I think I've been there once." Morrison asked, "Did you go to an underground culvert at Bathpool Park for any reason?" "Yes, I found a manhole cover open and went down and walked through there." When Officer Wright mentioned the idea that Neilson may have had an accomplice, the prisoner once again became irritable. Quote, "Why do you mention an accomplice? Why bring others into this? Are you saying that you were responsible for every offence? If so, then surely the next logical question must be to ascertain anybody else's involvement," replied Morris. After a further 25 minutes, and Mr. Wright repeating the accomplice question, Neilson looked at him and stated, quote, "I didn't murder her. I didn't even know who I was going to get from the house." With this incriminating statement, Donald Neilson was formally cautioned. In subsequent interviews, Neilson went on to protest that much of the information about the Black Panther was all lies, and none of what the media reported was true. He then asked, "Can you protect my wife and daughter if I make a statement?" Although the officers could not make any guarantees, they were able to reassure Neilson enough to the extent that he started writing a detailed account of each of his crimes. However, he maintained that he was not responsible for Leslie Whittle's death. While held in custody awaiting trial, it was arranged that Donald could be visited by his wife and daughter. I wonder how they felt, seeing the man who was to them a father and husband, but to the outside world was a vicious and calculating killer. Did Irene look upon the man she loved and questioned what made him the monster he had become? Donald Neilson was born on the 1st of August 1936. His family lived in a one-up, one-down terraced house in the market town of Morley, approximately 5 miles away from the city of Leeds. Being a child in wartime Britain, he experienced the blackouts, rationing, and the terrifying threat of enemy bombs. Donald also suffered an unhappy childhood, for it was only when he was older that he took the surname Neilson. He was born Donald Nappy, and due to him coming from a poor household, his clothes were often dirty and his appearance unkempt, which led to him being bullied and being teased with names such as Dirty Nappy. Donald was also picked on for his height. Jerry Corfield, who attended school with Neilson, remembered him as, quote, a small and wiry child who enjoyed playing at soldiers, fighting, wrestling, anything where he could try to prove his physical prowess. Throughout his life, he would feel ashamed of his height, and it became something that he grew to despise about himself. His home life wasn't much better. He came from a poor family, living in a run-down area of Morley. His mother Phyllis doted on him. She kept a pristine house, ensured her children, Donald and his younger sister Joyce, were well looked after, while also working long, arduous hours in a local textile factory. She was a loving mother, but her health deteriorated. She found herself unable to work, care for her children, or maintain her house. She became bedridden and endured excruciating pain, to the point that neighbours would hear her cries. After a long, painful battle with breast cancer, she passed away when Donald was just 10 years old. This loss devastated the young boy. Following the death of their mother, Donald and Joyce were in the care of their father, Gilbert. He was a strict authoritarian who was not adverse to hitting his children for misbehaving. On one occasion, shortly after his mother's death, Donald was caught trying to break into a local shop. He was reprimanded by the police, but no further action was taken. However, his father gave him a severe beating, which made the boy resolute that he would not be caught again. As Donald entered his teens, he was expected to take on the responsibilities his mother would have undertaken around the house, as well as attending school. His father expected everything to be done in a certain manner, and when he was not satisfied with his son's efforts, he would physically punish him or throw him out of the house. His father had relations with a number of women. Some reports state that these were just housekeepers. Others claimed they were lovers. Either way, the teenage Neilson, still grieving his mother's death, was unable to accept these new women. The final straw was when his father decided to remarry, at which point the 16-year-old left home and went to live with the family of Jerry Caulfield, his school friend. Donald started work as an apprentice joiner, acquiring skills that would later assist him in his criminal activities. But in his youth, he was a well-liked, hard-working lad. The family he lived with remarked that he was not a lazy boy, and would happily help out around the house. His school friend described Donald as being adventurous, willing to do what others wouldn't, and he wanted to be the best. He was considered the leader of his group of friends. The one thing that Donald was really passionate about was the military, in particular guns. Donald Neilson worked hard, and on the weekends he liked to play hard. By 1954, Donald had saved up enough money to buy himself a motorbike, and was now spending the weekends enjoying the nightlife at the dance halls of Bradford. Neilson was a keen dancer, and one night, while out on the dance floor, he met a young lady called Irene Tate. Their relationship flourished, even after Donald started his national service. Despite initially failing his basic training, he soon found he loved being in the army, although he was teased by his fellow officers for being just 5'6". He served as a lance corporal in the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry and was deployed in Kenya, Aden and Cyprus. Feeding his love of the military and developing skills that would make him such a proficient criminal. Donald Neilson is not the only killer who has served in the armed forces. Infamous serial killers such as Dennis Rader, Gary Ridgway, and Isabel Keyes were all ex-military personnel, And although there is no evidence to suggest that military service makes someone more likely to be a violent offender, it is clear that the skills acquired were utilised to commit their crimes. While on leave from the army, Donald married Irene in 1955 before returning to army life. During his time away, the couple would send letters to each other. However, 3 years later, Neilson was asked by his wife to leave the army. She wanted him to settle down and start a family, so the couple moved to a terraced house in Bradford. Donald utilised his skills as a joiner and did some home improvements. He built an extension on the rear of the house, and he created separate rooms to allow them to take on lodgers to help supplement their income. In 1960, the couple welcomed their daughter Catherine. Neighbours described them as being a quiet family who kept to themselves, but they seemed like a normal working-class family. This was reinforced by the lodgers that stayed at the family's home, who by all accounts enjoyed living with them and would even babysit for Catherine to allow Donald and Irene to go out to work or to go on dates together. It was the arrival of their daughter that drove Donald Nappy to change the family surname by deed poll to Neilson. This was in a bid to protect his child from the trauma he suffered due to his unfortunate surname. The now renamed Donald Neilson found life outside of the army tough. He struggled to adjust to civilian life, to the point that he bought himself a Willys Jeep, and would take his family on military exercises on the moors near their home. His house was also run with military precision. Donald controlled everything, including how his wife and daughter dressed and the length of their hair. If Catherine misbehaved, even just the slightest misdemeanour was punished by hard labour. She was treated more like an army recruit than a child. Neilson was so strict that he did not allow Catherine to have friends. He wanted to control every aspect of her life, scheduling every part of her day from the moment she woke up to when she went to bed. His work life, however, was in complete opposition to his need for control. No matter what he tried, he seemed to fail. He attempted to continue working as a joiner, but when he disagreed with his boss, he found himself unemployed. He went on to buy a taxi firm, which soon folded. He then attempted to start his own security firm, utilising his military credentials, but all his efforts were met with failure. Unable to support his family by legal means, in 1965 he took his first steps towards becoming the Black Panther. He blamed his descent into crime on his feeling that no matter how hard he worked, there were people who didn't work as hard who earned more. He bemoaned the fact that he was unable to afford a nice holiday or a decent car. He said, quote, "When I thought about what I was earning and what others were earning for doing no work at all, there didn't seem to be any sense in it. There was no point in being honest." The one thing about this comment is that the people he went on to target were individuals who worked hard for a living. They spent every hour of every day just trying to support their families. Before he gained the infamous title of the Black Panther, he was known by a number of other names. Yorkshire police nicknamed him the brace and bit robber, as he would use a tool known as a brace and bit to drill a hole in the window frame of a property, and would then use a screwdriver or a coat hanger to open the catch and gain entry to a home. He also became known as the Phantom and as Handy Andy. To confuse the police, he adopted a different modus operandi every few weeks. For example, he would steal a radio from each house he broke into, abandon it nearby, and then once that pattern was established, he would drop it and start doing something different. It is believed that Donald Neilson was responsible for more than 400 burglaries, and he proved he was very skilled in the art of breaking and entering, without leaving any incriminating evidence. By 1967, despite working as a builder, Neilson claimed the financial reward he gained from breaking into homes was not enough to support his family. So he chose to move on to riskier targets, but with bigger rewards. He decided to begin raiding post offices, with thousands of potential targets all over the country. He knew these shops would hold large amounts of money, the security would be limited, and many were situated in rural or semi-rural locations, which meant emergency response may be slower. Donald Neilson, however, had a phobia of dogs and would not target a premises where a canine was present. The key to his success during these raids was that he treated each post office robbery as a military operation. He would camp nearby. He would observe the habits of the postmaster, all daily comings and goings of the shop, for example, when deliveries would arrive. He would familiarise himself with the location and plot his routes, utilising his military training to escape across country and live off the land if needed. He made sure he was aware of police movements. For example, he knew that Harrogate was classed as a low crime area, and so policing was a low priority. He knew there would only be a couple of officers on duty in the area. Prior to his methodically planned operations, he would wash and shave. He also sprayed his clothes with disinfectant in an attempt to disguise his scent from police sniffer dogs. He also purposely chose to target different counties, knowing that the limited communication between police officers would help cover his tracks. He decided he would target shops in the winter, with the advantage of long dark nights, and due to the cold, fewer people tended to be about, meaning he was less likely to be spotted. The location of the post office was also key. He tended to target ones that stood at the junction of two roads, allowing him multiple escape routes. He would not travel by car, opting instead to use public transport. In the raid on the post office in Harrogate on the 15th of February 1974, after he fatally wounded postmaster Donald Skepper, Donald Neilson knew that when the police did arrive, they would place roadblocks. Therefore, he fled to a stream that ran around the outskirts of Harrogate and led him to the opposite side of the town. From there, he headed to the train station and left town, avoiding any of the roadblocks or scrutiny. It is possible he used the same method to escape the crime scene at Baxenden, where he claimed the life of Derek Aston. Given the post office's semi-rural location and the area having open farmland, parks and pathways that led through cloughs and woodland, it would have been so easy for this military-trained killer to evade capture by escaping across country. The raid on the post office run by Sidney and Peggy Grayland showed that Neilson had changed his approach. Unlike the raids in Harrogate and Baxenden, which he conducted in the early hours of the morning when the postmaster was asleep, he targeted the Graylands as they were closing the shop. It was reported that the couple had a specific routine when it came to closing the store on a night. Normally, while Peggy was finishing off the closing routine, Sidney would bring their car to the back door, ready to head home. There has been speculation that Neilson wasn't aware of this routine. However, he was a meticulous planner, and I believe he intended to surprise the couple while they were still in the shop. The fact that Sidney would fetch the car suggests to me that the couple may not have lived at the property. And if this was the case, Neilson may have decided to ambush them during closing time, when they would have either still been cashing up or would have at least had the key to the safe. Perhaps this change was also driven by the fact that in the previous raids he had been unable to locate the key to the safe, leading him to being discovered by the occupants in the property. This theory is further backed by his decision to attach a spray bottle containing bleach to his torch, which suggests he planned to incapacitate the couple by spraying them in the eyes. But he was surprised by Sydney opening the door, and his plan fell apart. Either way, his decision to raid the Greylands post office led to him taking the life of Sydney Greyland and leaving his wife for dead. One of Donald Neilson's rules was to never leave any witnesses. Unfortunately for Peggy, this meant that when Neilson was unmasked, he was forced to attack her in order to conceal his identity. One consistent theme that runs through Neilson's crimes is that despite his weeks of preparation, if things do not go to plan, or he is challenged, he becomes angry and loses control, with devastating results. Prior to being caught, Donald Neilson liked to play games with the police. He would cash stolen postal orders under false names, such as B. Ware or C. Trail, the last one implying the police should trace where the postal order came from. This demonstrates that he clearly enjoyed the thrill of not being caught. The fact he also had a statue of a Black Panther also suggests he enjoyed the publicity he was gaining. To Neilson, the post office raids were a temporary fix. He had been meticulously planning a more daring crime that would yield greater financial rewards. He wanted to kidnap somebody and hold them to ransom. He claimed his original target would be either Ronald or Dorothy Whittle, after reading the article in the Daily Express regarding the court battle between Leslie's family and Selina Whittle, the wife of her late father. Despite Neilson's claims that he believed Leslie was away at school and was surprised to discover her in the bed, police speculate that Leslie, who would have been a much easier person to abduct due to her size and demeanour, was always the one he planned to kidnap. His plans, however, were scuppered by international events. When in 1973 the Arab-Israeli War caused the Organisation of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, known as OPEC, to place a ban on the trade of oil. This resulted in a global recession. Commodity prices soared, and the stocks of fuel, being unable to meet demand, led to fuel shortages. The economical effects led the UK government to implement a pay freeze on all public sector workers, which meant that employees were finding it harder to afford to buy essentials and pay their bills. Among those affected were the coal miners, who in 1974 began striking over their pay. As the miners downed their tools, the coal-fired power stations were unable to provide enough power for the country, and so the government enforced the 3-day working week in order to conserve energy. This led to blackouts and restrictions in electricity usage, which was lifted in March 1974. Neilson argued that these events prevented him from carrying out his kidnapping plan until 1975. He stated that he would have drawn too much suspicion on himself, travelling the 130 miles from Bradford to the Whittles' home in Highley. Combined with the restrictions on fuel and the cost, meant he was unable to proceed with his plans, and so he decided to wait until January 1975, when he would be able to operate more easily. The location he planned to hold Leslie was 70 miles south of his home in Bradford, and roughly 50 miles north of the Whittles' home in Highley. Neilson claimed that he had discovered the tunnels at Bathpool Park by accident, when scouting locations for the ransom drop. However, given the meticulous planning that went into his crimes, I suspect he was already aware of the existence of the tunnels, as the construction work for the new railway line, which took place 9 years earlier between 1964 and 1967, was publicised at the time. Having read the article regarding the kidnapping of the American student Barbara Makel, he may already have had an idea of keeping Leslie underground, and if he had seen an article regarding the construction of a new railway tunnel with ventilation and drainage shafts in Bathpool Park, he may have seen the warren of tunnels were ideal for him to move around undetected, as well as preventing anyone hearing Leslie's cries for help. After producing an 18-page statement, Neilson was charged with the kidnapping and murder of Leslie Whittle, as well as the murders of Donald Skepper, Derek Aston and Sidney Grayland. Given the high-profile nature of the case and the need for an impartial jury, the decision was made to conduct the trial at Oxford Crown Court. On the first day of trial, on June 14, 1976, Donald Neilson was dressed in a black suit, white shirt and a striped tie. Throughout the proceedings he would stand to attention when the judge, Mr. Justice Mars Jones, would enter the courtroom, and he would address the barristers as sirs. Neilson pleaded guilty to the kidnap of the 17-year-old and demanding money with menaces, but he pleaded not guilty to her murder. During the trial, over 800 pieces of evidence were presented to the court. These included the tape recorder, which was recovered from the stolen Morris, reels of the wire used to tether Leslie to the ladder in the drain, which had been found in the Morris and at Neilson's home. Leslie Whittle's hair was discovered on the rear seat of the car. An imprint of Neilson's right hand on a notebook found in the drainage shaft. This notepad also contained a script for Leslie to follow when recording the ransom tapes. The prosecution's case was presented by Philip Cox QC. He alleged that Neilson entered the Whittle home between 4 and 5 a.m. on the morning of the 14th of January. He bound and gagged her using elastoplasts and placed a blindfold on her. He then drove her to Bathpool Park to the drainage shaft, next to the Manchester to Euston railway line, where he attached one end of a wire to the ladder and the other he fastened around Leslie's neck, like a dog leash. He then removed her bindings and blindfold and left her in the darkness, naked, with a thin foam mattress and a sleeping bag for warmth. They argued that Neilson did not provide the teenager with any food or drink during her captivity, which Neilson vehemently denied. The prosecution argued that it was while in the dark, damp drainage shaft that Neilson forced Leslie to record her ransom tapes, suggesting that it was possible that the teenager was attempting to leave a clue with the line, "I got a bit wet," maybe trying to indicate she was near water. Philip Cox suggested that following the failed calls to the phone box in Kidderminster on the first night following the kidnapping, Neilson returned to Bathpool Park and spent the day concealed underground, emerging at nightfall to head to Dudley and lay his ransom trail. A number of witnesses testified to seeing Neilson in Dudley that night, and Mrs. Isherwood was called to testify that she saw a man matching Neilson's description on a car park in Dudley at approximately 10:25. The man had a green envelope and stood close to a green Morris. Diligently, the witness made a note of the registration, which was found to match the car abandoned by Neilson at the freight yard where Gerald Smith was shot. He was also seen drinking in the Station Hotel pub, which was just around the corner from the freight yard. He claimed to be a lorry driver and was dressed accordingly. 44-year-old married father of two, Gerald Smith, the security guard shot 6 times by Donald Neilson, spoke of his encounter with the Black Panther, recalling that he spoke to him, warning that he would report him for trespassing. He stated how after he had fallen to the floor, his assailant then shot him a couple more times. Following the incident, Gerald Smith had to undergo 4 surgeries. Portions of Donald Neilson's statement were presented by the prosecutor. In one excerpt, he claimed he had told Leslie that his tape recorder had broken, and he wished to make a new recording. This was on the 16th of January, by which time Leslie had been underground for 48 hours without food or drink. This recording was to advise her brother to make the ransom drop at Bathpool Park. The instructions on the tape advised Ronald Whittle to find instructions in a Kidsgrove phone box. These read as follows: drive past wall and flash headlights. Wait for torch flash. Run to torch. Instructions on torch. Go home, wait for telephone. Mr. Cox stated, what happened next is of a considerable importance. He of course believed he was in serious danger of being arrested. I submit on behalf of the prosecution that the evidence points strongly to the fact that he went down there in order to push her off the landing before making an escape, and I suggest that the possibility of having to do that was in his mind from the time he selected that place for her imprisonment. When the time came for Donald Neilson to take the witness stand, he would go on to give evidence for 4.5 days. He claimed he was proud of the kidnap operation, claiming his conscience was clear regarding Leslie's death. He described at length how he'd considered holding Leslie in a shed, a garage, or maybe a boat, but had settled on the maze of storm drains because her cries for help would never be heard, and it gave him so many escape route options. He summed up his philosophy when he said, quote, the most important part to me of any crime is to be free at the end. Despite his due diligence, Neilson was witnessed a couple of times prior to the kidnapping. A mother and daughter saw Neilson visiting Bathpool Park on the 13th of January. He was described as being smartly dressed and looked out of place in the park. The car he used in the abduction had also been seen on the quiet cul-de-sac behind Leslie's home. It was discovered that the Green Morris had been stolen from West Bromwich in October 1974, which just showed the extent to which Neilson had planned the kidnapping. It is possible that he did not intend to abandon the car at the scene of Gerald Smith's shooting, but he needed to escape quickly and was forced to leave the car behind. As he stood in the dark, Neilson explained how he arrived at the Whittles' home at about 2 a.m. on the 14th of January. He made entry to the house via a door inside the garage by unscrewing the lever handles and turning the key with a pair of pliers. He then described how he proceeded to cut the phone line before heading upstairs. He explained how he woke Leslie from her sleep and stated that he was, quote, gentle but positive. I use sentences of 2 or 3 words spoken as I speak now. Once he had taken the teenager from the house, he advised that he made her lie on the back seat of the Morris and concealed her under a foam mattress. As they drove away, she started to make a fuss, and he claimed he told her to be quiet, stating, quote, I used a rather harsh voice. It was a voice of command. He described how he intended to keep his hostage in the drainage shaft where, quote, there was an ample supply of fresh air. When asked why he placed the tether around Leslie's neck, he stated, The wire was a cord of many strands. It would be possible to separate each strand once fastened to a limb or the wrist, and once separated, the individual strands would be broken. He called Leslie Whittle his ace in his plan. He boasted that he had, quote, pitted his weapon of stealth and secrecy against police detection in a manner that only the SAS expertise could foil. He told the court that he had no intention of harming Leslie, quote, throughout my entire plan, she was, as it were, my ace, because when she was released, she was the person who would not give any information to the police. The strongest possible weapon the police could have had in trying to detect me would have been a body. At no time did I intend to give police such a weapon. It would have been like committing suicide. Through tears, he proceeded to claim that he took care of the teenager. He stated he was never violent towards her, a claim which was backed up by the post-mortem findings, which showed no signs of assault. He claimed he supplied Leslie with a torch, a sleeping bag, a copy of Vogue magazine, fish and chips, and even a bottle of brandy. However, these claims were contradicted by the post-mortem, which revealed Leslie had not eaten in days. The prosecution argued that if he had supplied Leslie with a torch, she would have been able to see the edge of the platform, and furthermore, no torch was found in the subsequent search. There was, however, a sleeping bag and a flask containing soup nearby. Following the failed ransom drop at the park, a couple who were in Bathpool Park at 2:30 a.m. testified that they had seen a torch flashing. They also claimed to have seen a police car pull up and the driver get out to have a cigarette. It was suggested that this is what caused Neilson to abandon the ransom drop. However, Staffordshire Police deny that any of their officers were near the park that night. In his statement, Neilson admitted that following the sighting of the police car, quote, I decided there was no point waiting any further. I entered the shaft through the grille opening and went along the tunnel after climbing into the short pipe leading to the platform. As I came down onto the platform, the girl moved to her right to allow me onto the platform beside her. As I stood on the platform, she went over the side and was suspended from the wire I had placed there earlier to prevent her leaving the tunnel. I saw her eyes. Her eyes seemed to be half closed and stopped moving. I froze and then I panicked. Interestingly, throughout that statement, he never once mentioned Leslie's name. He described the teenager's last moments, quote, she was hanging, as it were, partly under the gantry. There was some movement, and her right hand stretched behind her. The torch was pointing in her face. Her eyes flickered and stopped. Everything stopped. There was no movement. It was then that I realised she was dead. It stopped me, as it were, dead in my tracks. Pathologist Dr. Brown testified that it was possible that Leslie could have been saved after her fall. Despite her heart stopping instantly, there were several minutes in which she could have been revived before her brain died. Neilson claimed to have exited the shaft and fled. As he did so, he dropped his bag. He stated, quote, a car drove out of Bathpool down the road towards Kidsgrove. I think the same car came back seconds later, with no lights on. At this point I thought I was near to be surrounded. I started to collect the things and put them into the bag. I heard the sound of dogs coming, as near as I could tell from the dead-end track. I panicked and fled in the opposite direction. As well as stating he heard dogs, he also reckoned that there was a helicopter overhead. However, there is no record of any helicopter near the park that day. The prosecution countered Neilson's claims that he had panicked upon seeing that Leslie was dead. Quote, he had the presence of mind to take with him a bag It was suggested that Neilson had used the nearby canal to escape, and that he may have been responsible for a number of the canal boats being broken into, and food had been stolen over the time Leslie was being held. In the weeks following the failed ransom drop at Bathpool Park, a number of items were found by members of the public. Some girls out horse riding reported finding a pair of binoculars. Police learned that these had been paid for using a stolen checkbook under the name Turner and were purchased from a shop in Manchester in 1972. The girls also found a tartan bag, inside of which there was a hammer. 2 boys playing in the park discovered a pair of thermos flasks, a plastic raincoat, and some cakes which were still fresh. These were believed to be items Neilson failed to pick up in his hurry to flee the park. And in February, some schoolboys found the torch with the instructions to drop the suitcase down the hole taped on it. The ease at which these items were found led to a criticism of the original search conducted by Scotland Yard, with speculation that had the search been more thorough, they may have found Leslie alive. The most heart-wrenching moment of the trial came when those in the courtroom were played the ransom tape. The timid voice of 17-year-old Leslie Whittle filled the silent chamber, and it was noted that Neilson wept uncontrollably. When Neilson was asked if he had killed Leslie, he erupted in a fit of anger. Quote, "I disclaim all responsibility for her death. I did not kill her. My conscience is clear as far as the act of killing her. I did not." He claimed, quote, "I carried the girl like a baby. The situation she was in was that she did not know where she was going," he said. "She had to be reassured to let her know I was on her side, as it were." The defence argued that Neilson had tethered Leslie to ensure she didn't come to harm, to which the judge quipped, "You may think there is some force in that, but members of the jury, would you have used a loop of that kind to secure a dog?" In the closing statements, defence attorney Mr. Gilbert Grace QC argued, "If you keep a girl unlawfully, and I must agree she was kept unlawfully, in perilous conditions, and an accident happens because of your hostile acts, then that is manslaughter, not murder." On the 1st of July 1976, the jury of 10 men and 2 women took just 1 hour and 55 minutes to return a unanimous verdict of guilty. Donald Neilson was given a life sentence for each of the 4 murders he committed, plus another life term for causing grievous bodily harm to Margaret Peggy Grayland, the wife of Sidney Grayland. He was also convicted of kidnapping, blackmail, making threats to kill, burglary, and possessing firearms with intent to endanger life. A charge of attempting to murder security guard Gerald Smith was left on file, due to the year-and-a-day law that was still in place at the time. Neilson would never formally be convicted for the death of Gerald Smith, and he has become a forgotten victim. The judge, Mr. Justice Marge Jones, stated, quote, that in Neilson's case, life must mean life. Only great age or infirmity should be used as a reason to release him. Due to the nature of the case, with its extensive and distressing evidence, the judge recommended that the jury should be exempt from jury service for 10 years. Following the verdict, Donald Neilson had been taken to the cells below Oxford Crown Court, where Gilbert Gray QC visited him. The solicitor said, quote, "He found his client in the corner of his cell, curled up in a prenatal position, totally broken and dejected, filled with immense remorse for Leslie Whittle and her family. The question is, were these tears genuine, or was the caged panther just sorry he got caught?" Neilson's mental state was assessed prior to the trial, and he has been examined on several occasions since. He was found to be a highly intelligent individual with obsessive traits and demonstrated signs of paranoia as well as psychotic and psychopathic tendencies. Bob Booth, the officer who had been in charge of the initial search for Leslie, visited Neilson in prison. It was his first opportunity to see the man he had risked everything for, and he recorded their conversation. Neilson commented on his now infamous title, quote, "The people loved it, didn't they? I mean, it filled its purpose. If they'd called me the Pink Panther, you wouldn't have got half the response." He continued by speaking about the kidnapping of Leslie Whittle. Please bear in mind the sound quality is not brilliant, as this was a covert recording taken in a prison cell. But here is an excerpt.
We've got two sides. Here, I'm on one side. Here, I did it on the other. Here, somebody is to blame for that girl's death. And I don't got the bloody truth. What went wrong? Well, I mean, you say you were right. Where in the fuck? What did I write? So what went wrong? Well, I'm going to say I blame you.
He essentially blamed Bob Booth and the police force for Leslie Whittle's demise. Throughout his years in prison, Donald Neilson would never accept responsibility for what happened to the 17-year-old girl, who he took from her bedroom in the middle of a cold winter's night, hid her underground, naked, frightened and alone in the darkness. Donald Neilson's daughter, Catherine, was roughly the same age as Leslie, and shockingly just 2 days before he kidnapped the heiress, he was at home celebrating his daughter's birthday. Catherine has openly expressed her hatred for her father's actions. Donald Neilson was among a small group of whole-life tariff prisoners who had been sentenced to die in jail. This group included the Moors murderer Ian Brady, the Yorkshire Ripper Peter Sutcliffe, and Rosemary West. At the time of his death in December 2011, he was one of the longest-serving prisoners in the UK. It had been revealed in 2008 that he was suffering from motor neuron disease, which according to the NHS is, quote, an uncommon condition that mainly affects people in their 60s and 70s, but it can affect adults of all ages. It's caused by a problem with the cells in the brain and nerves called motor neurons. These cells gradually stop working over time, but it's not known why this happens. Motor neuron disease gets gradually worse over time. Moving around, swallowing and breathing gets increasingly difficult, and treatments like a feeding tube or breathing air through a face mask may be needed. The condition eventually leads to death, but how long it takes to reach this stage varies a lot. A few people live for many years or even decades with motor neuron disease. His death was reported by the prison service, quote, HMP Norwich prisoner Donald Neilson was taken to outside hospital in the early hours of Saturday, December the 17th, with breathing difficulties. He was pronounced dead there at approximately 6:45 p.m. on Sunday, December the 18th. Following his death, his daughter Catherine sent the nurses who cared for her father flowers, thanking them for providing him care in his final days. By the time of his death, he was unable to do anything for himself and was completely reliant on the kindness of others. We must not forget that despite how he died, he lived a long life, something he took from those he killed. His reign of terror affected so many people, from the people he burgled, the family of his victims, and the officers who invested so much in the search for him. Donald Neilson claimed the lives of Donald Skepper, Derek Aston, Sidney Grayland, Leslie Whittle, and Gerald Smith. Thank you for joining me for this 3-part series on Donald Neilson. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on the case. During my research for these episodes, I got to learn a little bit about my own family. Neilson was operating around about the time my mum and dad were courting. My dad lived in Accrington, not far from the post office where Neilson shot and killed Derek Aston. And as stated in episode 20, my dad was one of the many drivers stopped by police during the search for the killer. My mum was living in Kidsgrove at the time, and my dad would travel to visit her. They would go on dates in Bathpool Park. My mum recalls that they were there just 2 weeks prior to Leslie's body being found. She also remembers the police doing door-to-door inquiries, and they questioned her family. They were very interested in the fact that her boyfriend was from Accrington, he drove a green car, and that he had knowledge of Bathpool Park. Fortunately, despite the coincidences, my dad was never considered a suspect. I'd be interested to know if you have any connections to crimes. If so, I would love to hear your stories. Please join the Facebook discussion group or follow It's Murder Up North on Twitter. There is also a Patreon page where you can access exclusive content and hear episodes before they are released. Join today at www.patreon.com/It's Murder Up North. The support I receive on Patreon helps pay for essential equipment and research materials for the show, which hopefully means my episodes are of a good quality and have reliable information in them. I love doing this show, and your support through listening, reviewing, following and subscribing means the world to me. Episode 23 is available next week. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.